What do you guys think is important when it comes to Mythic Plus? Why would you think one class is S tier and one class is Z tier? Is it just the damage? Is it the utility they have? How much value do you put on utility compared to how much value do you put on damage? How about the type of damage? Is it all you want in Mythic Plus, just AoE? Or do you also value cleave or single target? What about priority damage? If you have 3 DPS that only do AoE, and there is a pack with a giant guy and 6 small guys, it would probably be valuable to have someone with priority damage, like, I don't know, a sub-rogue, who can gain a ton of combo points because there is 7 mobs in there, but they can dump all the damage on that big beefy single target. So this all comes down to a single rating, sort of judging and weighing all the pros and cons of these damage profiles, their overall damage and their utility. Obviously we are in tuning season, so some things are still going to change. I'm going to point out which one of the specs in particular are currently a little bit overtuned and getting a little bit a higher rating simply due to how much damage they are doing, and they would be lower if their damage will sort of be balanced a little bit. But anyways, let's get going with the range DPS for Mythic Plus in Shadowlands. Now let's start with a 2-for-1 deal. BM Hunter in the B tier and Marksmanship Hunter in the C tier. Now Hunters have the best mobility of all range DPS. They basically can cast while moving, everything except for aim shot. They are not really worried or bothered by things like volcanic, by things like quaking. One of the new affixes is especially fightful, with mobs chasing around you. It's also going to make them much stronger because they can just keep doing DPS while moving, while other range DPS specs are going to be interrupted. So just off of their mobility, off of their utility, with an Enrage Dispel, they have a pseudo immunity, they can have a cheat that to cheese some target mechanics. They can bring, if they want, Bloodlust, BM Hunter anyways. They have, they have Freezing Trap, they can have a stun, or they can have Binding Shot, so they have a ton of utility and mobility, and defensives are good, so they could be S tier off of this already. The problem is that their damage profile is very stable, very sustained, very consistent, but it lacks burst. When it comes to Hunter, you have a way to gain burst, especially with the rework of Wild Spirits. If you go Night Fae, especially if you're a hunter that doesn't care about raids, and you're like, okay, my weakness is burst, I'm gonna take the burstiest of all covenants to make up for that weakness, then okay, you can go 1 tier higher just because of how strong Wild Spirits can be, especially in heavy AoE, but beyond that, they lack burst. BM Hunter's Bestial Wrath is a very short cooldown. It barely even categorizes as a burst. It's like almost in your rotation, so you're left with Aspect of the Wild, which is very weak. Marksmanship is even worse. They have True Shot, which is shit as a cooldown. They do have good priority damage because they are an auto attack class, which means even when they do AoE, they are still auto-attacking their primary target. Their pet is auto-attacking their primary target. Some of your abilities that you use in your rotation are still single target, like Kill Command, so they're still good in priority damage. They are still very good in sustained damage, as I mentioned, but that's what they miss for Mythic Plus. When you have a tank pulling 15 mobs, you want to have burst, otherwise you're going to be left behind. So this is why Hunter is not in a tier that would match their utility, their mobility, and even their damage when it comes to consistent situation, which Mythic Plus isn't. Mythic Plus is definitely not consistent. One thing, and the reason why Marksmanship is currently lower than BM Hunter, is because I'm not considering a current interaction to be going out live, which is the fact that Marksmanship Hunters right now are taking Serpent Stalker's Trickery to also shoot 3 Arcane shots when they consume trick shots with their aim shot. The problem is that they are also talenting in Chimera Shot, which replaces their Arcane shot with Chimera Shot, and Chimera Shot does nearly 4 times the damage of Arcane shot, so this legendary is instead shooting Chimera shots as an extra rather than Arcane shots, which is ridiculously broken right now. It is giving them the burst they are basically missing, and I don't think this is supposed to go live like this, which is why I'm taking them down a notch compared to BM Hunter. Beyond that, both Hunter specs are going to be very stable, very consistent, and very good in general. They just lack this, this little extra, this burst, to make it one of the best Mythic Plus specs. Now we go to the bottom instead. We go to Demonology Warlock. The reason why I'm going for Demo next is because when I said Hunters have a very stable, very good sustained damage with not many cooldowns and not much setup required, Demo is essentially the opposite. Demonology has almost all of its damage around pets and also cooldowns, setups. They need to build up their soul shards, they need to pull out their Dreadstalkers, they need to pull out their Vile Fiend, they need to pull out their Felguard, and then they can pull out the Demonic Tyrant, and then they start their burst. This is a lot of setup required for a Mythic Plus key. You have to play around the pool, you have to play around essentially your tank, you have to be coordinated. So it's just about the worst pug specs you can go for. Even in organized play, what they can do is not necessarily better than some of the DPS specs that are going to be at the top. Their utility, they have Hellstones, they can get a Battle Rest with Soulstone and some portals, although they're not as useful in Mythic Plus as they are in raids. They're also cursed as a spec that needs a Felguard out to never have an interrupt, but just a single target stun and the AoE stun. So overall, they have the possibility to do good damage, but it requires too much setup to be consistent in Mythic Plus. Now we move from Demonology and its problems with setup with Destruction sitting in A tier. Now Destruction is the opposite, it doesn't have any setup problems. Imagine having a 6 or 7 or 8 target pool in Mythic Plus and your Demo lock has 0 pets out versus your Destro lock. Destruction is going to drop down an Infernal and drop down Cataclysm, and within 2 GCDs and about 3 seconds he's gonna have every one of those mobs tagged with Immolate and an Infernal on top of them, and he's casting Rain of Fire on top of them, and then he's gonna Havoc the second priority target the big target, and start chunking down Chaos Bolts. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening for Destro, Demonology was just about to pull out their second pet, and that's all it is. Destruction retains most of the utility and defensives from Demonology. They still have their portals, they still have their Soulstone, their Hellstone, but what they have on top of Demo is that they can first of all choose their pet if they want to. They can have an interrupt, they can have a dispel, they can have an extra defensive, whatever they want, and then they just have better burst. They have better burst, they have better priority damage, they have Havoc, which is generally extremely good in raids, but also very useful in certain Mythic Plus pack with enemies that require focus targeting. They have quick on-demand AoE, and their cooldown burst is insane. It's obviously disgusting right now in BFA, but even with all the removal of borrowed powers, their Infernal, and even their Infernal coupled with Dark Soul instability, is extremely strong. One of their legendaries can also reduce the cooldown of their Infernal, which is going to help them even more. You can reliably bring down your 180 second cooldown of your Infernal down to 120, even less. It makes it very strong. So while retaining the same mobility, the same utility and defensives as Demo, their damage profile is just better. They can ramp up much faster, they have much less setup requirements, and they also are capable with a much easier to pull out burst. Even if in a theoretical world Demonology could have higher burst, mobs in Mythic Plus don't live forever, so the quicker you can pull out your burst, the better, and Destruction right now is just that much better than Demonology. Next, Fire Mage. Fire Mage goes all the way down in the bottom. Again, don't get misled by the current version of Fire Mage in BFA. I already mentioned the problem with Fire Mage, which is the fact that they are currently simply too undergeared and they are simply too dependent on borrowed powers to make them viable. They have too little crit on release to make their hot streak valuable. They don't have any borrowed powers, giving them some cheats when it comes to their Fire Blasts. There's been a slight buff to Mirrors of Torment. Now Mirrors of Torment is also going to give you back charges of Fire Blast. Problem, Mirrors of Torment lasts for 20 seconds and it takes a while to give you the charges back, which is not a good thing in a Mythic Plus pack to hope on and to rely on. It's much better in raids. When it comes to Mythic Plus, the profile damage of Fire Mage is still very good. They are still very slippery, they have an invulnerability, they can give you intellect, and remember that intellect scrolls have been removed from the game. They have of course Bloodlust, they have a Polymorph, and their burst with combustion is still extremely strong. Problem is that, as I said, right now their gear is just too low, and right now they simply don't have enough borrowed powers to skyrocket this mechanic into pure OPness. I'm sure that 1 or 2 tiers from now, Fire Mage is going to go back to being completely broken, but until then, they are just not reliable enough. They can go through a pool where they dump all of their Fire Blast charges, and then they go into the next pool where they have no charges and no combustion, and they have 27% crit. You know, it's miserable. It's miserable right now. You just have to wait a bit. Luckily, you're a mage, and you can play 3 different specs, so you don't have to play Fire Mage if it's just that weak on release. But for now, this is where Fire Mage stays. And a tier above Fire Mage, we have Arcane. Arcane has been improved overall coming into Shadowlands. As I mentioned, they have a slightly easier way to set up their burst. You could have before linked Arcane with Demonology. They had too long of a time to build up their burst. A lot of their burst was mostly single target based. Discharging Arcane Barrage on 4 targets wasn't enough to be strong AoE anyways. Now though, they can start a pool with Touch of the Magi. They have immediately 4 charges. They can splash some AoE with Touch of the Magi. They can talent into Arcane Echo to do even more AoE. Their mobility has also been improved because now they can play around amplification. Their clear casting is better. It allows them to store up to 2 charges, so their cast on the move with Arcane Missiles has been improved as well. They retain the same utility and defensives and mobility as Fire Mage, so that's still good. However, they still have setup time with their burst, their AoE is still lacking, they are still in a situation where they are forced to go into melee range to spam Arcane Explosion to AoE, unless the Touch of the Magi Pred AoE setup is going to work. One thing to mention though for Arcane is that the first season is going to have Prideful. Now, one of the things Prideful does as a buff is also giving you massive mana regen. Now, this is usually pointless for a caster that does DPS, however, for an Arcane Mage this could turn out to be extremely strong. The fact that they don't have to worry about mana in Mythic Plus, or at least not that much. So this could be much stronger than we are thinking. That there could be a small asterisk next to Arcane Mage. However, similar to the poor Demo, they are in a similar situation where they're getting bullied right now by their better class spec. Next we have Balance Druid. Now, the reason why Balance Druid is in B tier is because half of you will think that Balance is in S tier and half of you will think Balance Druid is in D tier. So I said, okay, let's just make everyone happy, or no one happy, and put them in B. Why? Because Balance Druid has a ridiculous amount of utility, even stronger now in Shadowlands. Balance Druid has access to Solar Beam, which is a massive 8-second AoE silence. They have Typhoon for knockback. They have Ursal Vortex for a pull-in. They can go for Mighty Bash as a stun or Mass Entanglement. They have Normal Entanglement. They have Cyclone baseline. They can Decurse and remove poison, and they can also remove enrages. They have Stampeding Roar. They can off-heal. They have a Battle Res. If they go for Heart of the Wild, they can even go into bear form and legit tank for like 30 seconds a tyrannical boss. It's ridiculous, the amount of utility they have. This alone would put, to some of you, Balance Druid in S tier. Now the problem is the people who would put him in D tier is because of their damage. Druid has very good single target damage, very consistent single target damage, and okay consistent AoE. The problem is none of this is extremely valuable in Mythic Plus. Damage in single target to some degree is, the problem is AoE, cleave in a burst setting. Balance Druid has no cooldowns. Celestial Alignment is a 3-minute cooldown. It's terrible for Mythic Plus. They have no way to cleave properly. They have no burst AoE whatsoever. Their entire burst relies around putting down Sunfire, Pred on all targets, tab target Moonfire, activate your Starfall somewhere in between, and then spam Starfire to do some splash damage, even ignoring your own Eclipse, because there is no point using Wrath during Solar Eclipse if you are trying to hit 7 targets. It's still better to just spam Starfire that splashes AoE, and even then it's poor AoE, it's weak AoE, that's what they lack. Depending on how strong you value or how weakly you value the importance of the utility for Balance Druid, they can fluctuate a lot in this list for a lot of people. So I put them in B tier to stay sort of in the middle. And now we go for our only S tier spec. Now, Frost Mage has gotten a habit of becoming an extremely strong spec at the release of an expansion, and this is going to be the case as well. So Frost Mage retains all of the good things from Mage. Obviously, they still have Spell Steal, they have an Interrupt, they have a Remove Curse, they have a Polymorph, they have a Bloodlust, they have an Immunity, so it's still all there. The bonus when it comes to Mythic Plus is that they can also slow targets. They can also take Frigid Winds to slow them even more and have a perma-slow on all targets, which is handy in Mythic Plus. But the real thing is that the ability of Frost Mage to change damage profiles seamlessly is the strongest of all range specs and of all melee specs. There is no spec that can change the damage from AoE to cleave to single target as strong as Frost Mage. Most importantly, without changing legendaries or talents, Frost Mage can do that, which is what makes it so strong. All Frost Mage has to do is take Spitting Ice, one talent, and they have one of the strongest cleaves in the game. One talent, nothing else. They have an ability that they use for both single target and AoE, which is Frozen Orb. The only difference is that they get to cast Blizzard every 6 seconds or so, and that's it. Currently, Frost Mage with Freezing Winds is ridiculous. I pointed out that Fire Mage has a strong cooldown, but it's on a 2-minute cooldown, and right now the gear of Fire Mage and the borrowed powers to help them scale that is too low to make it strong. It might be stronger later on, but not now, whereas Arcane is just too clunky. Too much of a ramp up and too much difference between wanting to AoE with Touch of the Magi or Arcane Barrage multiple target sitting and the AoE from Arcane Explosion on melee range, whereas Frost Mage on the other hand has a 1-minute cooldown on Frozen Orb. And when they take Freezing Winds, it's legit a 25-second cooldown. This makes it borderline available for every single pull. It makes them so strong in every type of pull. That's why they're here. Yes, it is extremely boring to play Frost Mage. You're literally pressing 3 buttons. It's not very fun. There is no depth right now to the spec. However, what can I say? It's the strongest. So now on to Elemental, which is a special one because it's my main. So I have to stay a little bit unbiased on this. I have to stay a little bit more neutral. Elemental Shaman has changed from BFA, as I mentioned in my previous videos, massive damage increase in almost all of their abilities. They just hit harder. One of the biggest problems they had was the lack of cleave, 2 to 3 targets. They had this sort of void zone where they couldn't hit on single target, but they couldn't hit with massive AoE abilities. Now they have Echoes of the Great Sundering, which is a great legendary for consistent AoE and cleave damage. They have a stronger single target damage with all of their buffed abilities. Level Burst, especially Elemental Blast and Ice Fury, much stronger single target consistent damage now, purely because of how high their damage is in their abilities. Their Covenants are also giving them even more AoE burst. Their Legendary is giving them a massive Earthquake. They can go for Vesper Totem, Chain Harvest now that's been buffed, or even more AoE. Of course, they still have Stormkeeper for more AoE. They have their Elemental, although the Elemental sucks dick. If it was just for their damage, as I mentioned, they would be S tier, just by judging the current damage. However, there is tuning to be made. Even as my main, I don't think it's gonna stay like this coming live. And then there is also the other factor, which is that their utility is not that strong. It's something I always mention with Shaman. They have a ton of utility, but none of that utility is of the broken type. They have no party buff. They have no immunity, they have no combat rest, they have a stun, they have a grounding totem and a slow totem. They can pull out a helpful Earth Elemental, so their utility is sort of not very strong compared to something like a Druid or even a Paladin. One of the things that has gotten much stronger is that now, with your Covenants that also heal, especially the AoE ones like Vesper Totem or Chain Harvest, now that Ancestral Guidance is off the GCD, Elemental Shaman now has legit huge AoE healing burst that can help you in keys, especially because they don't even cost you damage loss anymore, because Ancestral Guidance is off the GCD and you're putting down Vesper Totem or Chain Harvest to do damage anyways, so that's gonna heal you as an extra. So that could be actually properly good. But beyond this minor thing, it's just currently a factor of damage. They have a good damage profile, they have strong single target, extremely strong AoE, and now also good cleave. But beyond that, whenever the damage dips a little bit, they sort of fall down, as opposed to other specs that can remain useful purely because of their kit, or the way they function, or the cheese they bring. Shaman doesn't properly have that. And next we have Affliction in A tier, next to Destro. Now, I could be falling for the bait, honestly, but I always categorized, as many of you I'm sure, as Affliction as these terrible Mythic Plus specs due to how slow they were in setting up their damage. What has gotten stronger now is that they have a much easier time setting up their damage in AoE situations, as opposed to before. Affliction has always had a very strong and consistent single target damage, and now they still have it. It has in fact even gotten stronger, especially if you go, I touched this twice already, since it's been nerfed. If you go Necrolord, you can go Decimating Bolt, you can pair the damage increase with Drain Soul, and you have extremely strong execute single target damage now. What changed in Mythic Plus for Affliction is their AoE and the addition of Malefic Rapture. Malefic Rapture being an AoE ability that does damage based on how many DOTs you have on the target. When a pull comes, you can use Seed of Corruption to instantly spread corruption. You can use Vile Taint to add an extra layer of DOTs running on all the targets. If you are a player more focused on Mythic Plus, as a Warlock you can also go Ventir and take Impending Catastrophe. So within 3 abilities, Vile Taint, Impending Catastrophe and Seed of Corruption, you have 3 DOTs on all targets. And you can start spamming Malefic Rapture and do pretty strong AoE damage, which is something Affliction before never had, which is what makes it way stronger, because they haven't lost single target for this. Their single target is still there, which is what they were strong before, but now they also have very good AoE. They still have insane dot cleave, the extra chance to generate soul shards with your agony when you spread it around, and they still remained and retain all of the utility from a Warlock. So that's why I am putting them in A tier. I do believe they have gotten much better than before when it comes to Mythic Plus at least. And we are going to close this with Shadow Priest in the A tier. Honestly, I should make a standalone video for Shadow Priest because of all the things that changed, but I do believe Shadow Priest has a lot of potential. The reworked Shadow Priest allows you to use Searing Nightmare when you are channeling Mindseer to instantly spread Shadow War Pain on all targets and then do massive AoE damage. They can still retain Shadow Crash or even extra AoE burst from the get-go. They can talent into Mindbender and take Shadow Flame Prism to give you even extra super strong AoE damage when you cast Shadow War Death and Mind Blast when your Mindbender is out. You can legit make your Mindbender last for 30 seconds. On a 1-minute cooldown, it's ridiculously strong. So if it was just for damage, Shadow Priest would be S tier. Easy. Their AoE damage is super strong, their cleave and dot cleave remains very strong, their single target is still good, especially now that they made Devouring Plague work like the Mage Ignite. So you no longer overlap your Devouring Plagues, you can stack them on top of each other. This makes them much stronger and much more consistent in single target. The reason why they're not in S tier is because of everything else. They still have average mobility and average utility. They can be rather stationary with all their Mind Flay and Mind Seer channeling. They do offer stamina as a buff. They can dispel the enemy and they can also dispel diseases. They have been slightly buffed because now you can mass dispel bursting, so that's good. But beyond that, they still remain very weak in utility. You know, they can go for Mind Bomb for an AoE stun, but it's, you know, the utility is kind of weak. Their defensive's better than Discipline and Holy at least. Dispersion is okay, but Dispersion, as it has triggered Shadow Priest since forever, is a DPS loss while they use it. So I'm putting them in A tier because they don't have the utility that matches up with the strongest. If you want to be the strongest, you should at least match up with Mage, and Shadow Priest doesn't have the same utility that Mage can bring, so I'm leaving them in A tier. So, and with this, we are done with the range DPS ranking that I have been able to see over these last month or so in the beta, looking at all the specs for DPS. Next up is going to be the melee version of this, and then I'm going to make something that really excites me to try, ranking them based on their enjoyability and how fun and engaging it is to play them. And then I'm going to compare that ranking with these rankings to see how Blizzard has currently matched, how enjoyable is a spec to play compared to how currently strong it is, and see what correlations we can draw from there. Let me know, guys, what you think. If you think some of these specs is much stronger than you think I put them, or much weaker maybe, or some interactions or strength I missed, and I'll see you guys soon with the other videos.